Extending Donald Trump's 2017 tax cuts comes at a hefty price, but it is something he intends to do, and certainly with the help of Republicans who now have control of both chambers of Congress. So the president-elect's economic advisors, along with some congressional Republicans, are basically planning these massive cuts to federal safety net programs that could negatively impact as many as 70 million low-income Americans. So that includes programs like Medicaid, food stamps, and more. So this was an important piece written by the Washington Post. I really want to give the journalists over at the Washington Post a lot of credit for diving into this, because when you hear about how the Trump administration wants to cut $2 trillion in spending, okay, well, where is that money going to come from? Well, where are you going to cut in order to save? Well, major portions of Trump's 2017 tax bill are set to expire at the end of next year. And extending those provisions, as Trump has proposed, would add more than $4 trillion to the already soaring national debt over the next decade, according to congressional bookkeepers. So I want to be clear about what part of Trump's tax cuts he's looking to extend. The tax cuts that he already implemented for the corporations, right? He took the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%, did not get rid of the corporate tax loopholes, which means that with deductions in mind, the effective tax rate for corporations is much lower. Okay, that's how you have companies that are very lucrative, very profitable, like Amazon, not having to pay a single dollar in federal taxes. Okay, so I think that the corporate tax rate part of his tax bill has been disastrous and has definitely led to a situation where the have-nots are expected to pay more in federal taxes than insanely rich, well-performing corporations. But that's also the part of Trump's tax bill that is permanent. The part that is not permanent is in regard to personal income taxes, right? And so that is set to expire, and Trump is looking to extend those tax cuts. And those tax cuts, yes, disproportionately helped the rich in the country, but there were also middle class and low income Americans who benefited from that as well, just not to the same extent as wealthy Americans. Now, just to give you guys all a reminder, this nation, much like American consumers, is absolutely drowning in debt. The debt exceeds $36 trillion. That's a lot of money. And so the Washington Post spoke with 7 people who are familiar with the talks that Donald Trump is having and Republicans are having in regard to finding areas to save in order to justify the massive loss of revenue the federal government is going to experience if we extend those tax cuts for personal income. And so what they're thinking about are things like work requirements to qualify for federal programs. The first Trump administration allowed 13 GOP-led states to add work requirements to their Medicaid programs. The requirements only took full effect in one state, though, in Arkansas, for a 5-month period when about 18,000 people were dropped from the program, the Medicaid program in Arkansas. So, when the work requirement was, when 13 Republican-led states tried to implement the work requirement, they were taken to court. And in the end, only Arkansas was able to implement that program. But look at that. I mean, 18,000 people got dropped from the state's Medicaid. I just think that healthcare should be provided for everyone, okay? Healthcare to me is not something that people are trying to defraud the system to get. And this idea that these lazy bums, they don't deserve health coverage and the ability to go to the doctor without, bills breaking them. It's just unnecessarily cruel. But they've also thought about possibly implementing spending caps to these federal safety net programs. So the House Budget Committee Chairman, Jody Arrington, who's a Republican from Texas, told reporters on last Wednesday, that a responsible and reasonable work requirement for Medicaid benefits resembling the one that already exists for food stamps could yield about $100 billion in savings. I also want to just note that it actually ends up costing the system quite a bit in order to implement work requirements, because you would need to have a system in place to make sure that people are working in order to qualify, right? So you'd have to hire more personnel. It actually ends up becoming a far more expensive system by implementing these work requirements. And oftentimes, the way of showing that you're at least looking for work or are working, but are just so low income. Okay, your boss is paying you so little that you can't even qualify, or you can't even pay your own bills working full time. Like if they, want to prove that they're working but aren't making enough money, for some people, right, that would require them to go online. The system might be confusing. They might run into problems. And so there's a barrier there when it comes to just simply proving that you're working so you can qualify for something that you desperately need, like healthcare. And I just think it's unnecessary. So he also said another $160 billion in reduced costs could come from checking Medicaid eligibility more than once a year. Okay, so is this really what we want to spend resources on? I mean, every single year ensuring that people deserve healthcare and that they're proving that they're working enough to qualify for Medicaid. Remember, Medicaid is for severely low income individuals. In fact, I think there are low income individuals who should qualify for Medicaid who don't qualify for Medicaid because they're allegedly making too much money, which is insane. But look, this whole fragmented healthcare system is so broken. It's awful in so many different ways. And we do spend way too much on healthcare in this country. Part of the reason why we spend way too much on healthcare in this country is because we allow pharmaceutical companies to rip us off. Rip us off on a personal level if you're just a private citizen who has private health insurance, and also on a governmental scale because you have Medicare and Medicaid, buying the same pharmaceutical drugs on behalf of the Americans that are covered by these plans, and they're not able to negotiate the prices of these drugs. I'm not talking about cost like setting. I'm not talking about the government coming in and saying, we are going to set the price for these drugs at $20 per bottle. That's not what we want. That's not what we're even saying. They're not able to negotiate for lower prices, thus allowing the pharmaceutical companies to rip off Americans, to rip off the Medicare system, which is funded by us, the taxpayers. And I just find it so fascinating that Republicans who have voted down bills that would allow for the Medicare system to negotiate drug prices are now looking to point fingers at the most vulnerable low-income Americans in the country and essentially paint them as bums who are unworthy of health insurance or health coverage. It really does irritate me beyond words. So as far as food stamps go, Republicans want to strip the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, also known as SNAP, of presidential authority. So you might not know about this. I actually was unfamiliar with it as well. But presidential authority essentially allows the White House to unilaterally increase benefits offered to individuals who qualify for SNAP. And so Republicans want to do away with that. Right now, SNAP benefits also increase automatically to adjust for inflation. And some of the Republicans engaging in these conversations are considering doing away with that as well, which is just so insane because think about how much inflation has impacted grocery prices. So if food stamps don't adjust for inflation, well, then the minuscule amount of money that low-income Americans get as food stamps or SNAP assistance are going to be worth even less. They're going to be unable to buy even like basic things that they might need in order to feed their families. And by the way, the other thing I just want to note about these programs, I think in the mind of some of these Republicans, they're in their minds, they're punishing lazy Americans who just want to live off, government cheese. And even if you buy into that, which I really hope you don't, but even if you do, let's say we take that at face value and actually believe it. I don't, but let's just say we do, for argument's sake. Do their kids deserve to suffer? Are we okay with kids going hungry? And why is this the priority when it comes to cutting spending? I mean, there's a lot of government waste. I'm not necessarily against taking a good hard look at government bureaucracy and questioning, hey, are there some areas here where we can actually save money? are there unnecessary, things going on? Are we giving out unnecessary contracts or doing things in a way that's less efficient with taxpayer money? I think that's a totally fine thing to look into. But rather than, I don't know, considering the fact that our military budget is bloated specifically because of the defense contractors, specifically because of government waste. I mean, the Pentagon has now failed 7 audits in a row. They have failed 7 audits in a row. Don't you think that maybe that's the first place you should look? But see, the reason why Republicans aren't looking there is because of, in my opinion, their donors. Their donors don't want them to look there. There's no lobbying group for low-income Americans in order to ensure that they're getting SNAP benefits. There's no big SNAP showing up to a congressional office and, engaging in bribes on behalf of low-income Americans. That's just not happening. And so money does talk. And I do think that lobbying is what takes the minds of these Republican lawmakers off of where the real government waste is. And instead, they're hyper-focused on the most vulnerable people who unfortunately do not have these powerful lobbying groups representing them and bribing politicians on their behalf. Now, in addition to spending cuts, Republicans are also considering repurposing clean energy funds allocated by Democrats. Trump is also saying that the federal government will raise revenue from tariffs. I want to just briefly focus on this for a second because this is important. Look, I don't think that targeted tariffs are necessarily a bad thing. And in fact, as I've said multiple times on the show, Donald Trump's specific targeted tariffs on China were expanded under the Biden administration. Okay, so in some cases, tariffs make sense. But what Trump is planning to do here is implement widespread tariffs, which of course increases prices for consumers because the companies who are importing items that have been manufactured abroad or made abroad, when they import them, that's when you pay the tariff. The tariff is a tax that is paid to the federal government. So yes, that will raise revenue for the federal government. But do you think that the corporations who are paying those tariffs to the federal government are just going to eat those costs and not pass them down to consumers? Of course they're going to pass them down to consumers, of course. So what this is essentially going to do is it's going to redistribute wealth from low-income Americans to these corporations, to these top earners. How is that going to happen? Well, remember, Trump is looking to cut taxes, and those taxes or those tax cuts are disproportionately going to help the wealthiest Americans. At the same time, due to that loss of federal revenue, Trump is planning to make up for that through the tariffs that he's going to implement. The cost of those tariffs will then be passed down to American consumers. And obviously, those costs are going to be a much bigger burden for low-income Americans. So look, it really depends on how he implements these tariffs. But if he thinks that he can cut taxes on the rich and make up for the loss of revenue by essentially implementing widespread tariffs, that is going to be a disaster for average working class Americans. And I'm very concerned about that. And one GOP tax advisor told the Post, I don't think that passing just an extension of tax cuts that shows on paper an increase in the deficit is going to be challenging. But the other side of the coin is you start to add things to reduce the deficit, and that gets politically more challenging. And so what this GOP tax advisor is getting at is, look, if you're going to cut social safety net programs in order to justify cuts on taxes for the rich, and then on top of that, you're going to make up for the lost revenue by implementing widespread tariffs that are going to lead to higher prices and inflation for ordinary American consumers, there's going to be political hell to pay. And I think he's right about that. Now, other ways the GOP could cut spending, but are unwilling to do so because of their precious donors, as I mentioned, cut the bloat in the military due to contracts with defense contractors, stop sending money to wars abroad. I know that some people get touchy about that, whether you're an Israel supporter or if you think that we're going to save Ukraine. But nonetheless, we spend so much money on wars abroad. And I think we really need to reevaluate what our priorities are. And finally, if you're worried about healthcare spending, please, for the love of God, allow Medicare to negotiate drug prices, all drug prices with pharmaceutical companies. Something tells me that's not going to happen. And I do think it's telling that when it comes to these lawmakers, the first place they look to cut spending are programs that disproportionately help the most vulnerable Americans among us.
If you enjoyed this video, that's because of our members. They make us independent, they make us strong, and they make us honest. Become a member today by hitting the join button below.